Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler, and thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of The Amateur Traveler is brought to you by Audible. Please visit audiblepodcast.com/traveler for your free audiobook download.
I got my bags packed and on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 185. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to the home of kings, popes, and atrocities as we visit Krakow in Poland. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have some news stories for you. The first one coming out of the EU is either very cool, very creepy, or probably both. They're looking at a technology to catch terrorists by scanning their brain as they walk through the airports. They're going to whisper the word like jihad into their ear and see what their brain does to react. Then I have two oops stories. The first one, a pilot accidentally switched on a hijacking alarm and caused the American Airlines plane he was in to be escorted to the airport by fighter jets. Oops. And then the second one, you remember that opening sequence for the show Lost from the pilot episode when someone walks in front of a jet engine that's still running and learns the hard way that you shouldn't do that? A baggage handler at LAX learned the same lesson this week. Fortunately, he was not hurt, but a large metal baggage container was sucked into the engine of a Boeing 747 as it was leaving the terminal gate. Oops. Check out links to all those stories, as well as changes that American Airlines is making to its mileage program to be a little more flexible, how you might be able to earn free travel using travel grants, and why United has added another fee by checking out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Before we get into this week's interview, I'd like to thank our sponsor, which is Audible.com. Audible.com is the internet's leading provider of spoken audio entertainment with over 50,000 titles to choose from. You can sign up for a free trial today and get your free downloadable audiobook by going to audiblepodcast.com/traveler. I'm currently listening to the Clue Train Manifesto, but you might want to listen to Angels and Demons by Dan Brown, which is coming out as a movie. I think it's better than the Da Vinci Code. Again, get your free audiobook by going to audiblepodcast.com/traveler. I'd like to welcome Raul from Atlanta to the show, who's come to talk to us about Krakow, Poland. Raul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris.
Now, first of all, Krakow is a popular destination, but not necessarily with people from the U.S. quite as much. What led you to Krakow?
My friend and I were looking for some off-the-beaten-path kind of trip, but because we were constrained to a week, we had to keep it somewhere accessible. In thinking about Europe, there were definitely other choices like Ireland, places like that, but Poland was a little more exotic, if you will, precisely because it's not the typical destination, at least for the people I talk to that travel normally. Poland in general, but Krakow specifically, very historic place, and that was a big draw for us as well.
We were talking briefly as we were setting this up that Krakow is one of those places on my list because I haven't been to much of what we used to call Eastern Europe. I think Krakow is actually Central Europe again. But what should I see if I go to Krakow?
What should you see? Well, the town is obviously got history at every corner almost. It used to be the capital of Poland. I forget how many years. I think it may have been 600 years or so till the early 1600s, late 1500s. So there's a lot of history. And that part of Poland, well, Poland in general obviously has been sliced up and divvied up throughout history and even disappeared from the map completely at some point.
Yeah, twice actually, as I recall.
Southern Poland in particular had a lot more contact with like the Austrian Habsburg Empire and things like that. And so it's kind of to me at the crossroads of a lot of the things that happened in Europe over the centuries. There's just a lot of history everywhere you go, and even modern history. Pope John Paul II being from a nearby town and having been cardinal in Krakow, even in that sense of modern history, there's a lot of things to see. So to me, first and foremost, the history itself, but the town, the architecture, the charm, it's quite enjoyable. You don't have to be a history buff to go and enjoy Krakow, I don't think.
Okay. And then let's get a little more specific. What did you do there and what did you see?
So in Krakow in particular, we walked a lot. I'm a big walker, and I think that's the best way to get a good sense of the city or a town. You have to start with the most important site, Wawel Castle. It's actually spelled with W's, but it's pronounced Wawel. It sits up top of a hill by the Vistula River, and that's the ancient home of the king and queens of Poland. There's a cathedral also as part of the compound, and that is a very historic site. You can spend probably more than one day if you really wanted to. They have different museums up in the hill, the royal chambers, the museum itself, the cathedral. I don't know if that you would call a museum, but it's got the tomb of all the kings and queens. So there's a lot to do just on that one hill in particular, and it's pretty close to the center of Krakow itself from an architecture standpoint, and have all sorts of churches from all sorts of periods in time. So Krakow itself, it also has just other museums outside of Wawel Hill itself throughout town, and I didn't get to cover most of those actually. It's just too much to go see and take in, because you also want to do the normal stuff like sit in cafes or enjoy just chilling as well. And that's just Krakow itself. There's the Kazimierz district. It's technically in Krakow, but it's outside of the city center. It's actually quite interesting, too. It used to be the Jewish quarter. I think it still may have some of that, but you're definitely in a different place when you go to that district. It has a distinct feel to it. And there's obviously cafes there as well, restaurants, the cemetery and synagogue and things like that to see. And it's pretty much a walking distance from city center.
Okay. So as I start exploring the city, I assume, because we're talking about a European town, in the main square?
Yeah, the main square, it's actually quite unique in Europe, I think, from all the countries I've been to. It is, I think, one of the largest, if not the largest, town square, city square in Europe, and it's incredible. It's just huge. In the middle of it, there's what used to be the cloth hall, I think it may still be called that, where people used to go and sell their wares. Now there's a lot of shops in there, and, a lot of the typical tourist souvenir stuff, but there may be other things like jewelry and things like that. The square itself is where you probably want to start from, because that is the anchor of the city. And from there, you branch off to all the different things you may want to see. And again, a lot of it is walking distance. So if you're going to hit the main churches, all the different architecture styles, you can quickly find your way around from that square. If you go south, then you hit Wawel Hill, which again is a pretty important site. And there are other secondary sites, like the city used to be surrounded by a wall, like many cities. You see the remnants of that north of the square, so still within, I don't know how many meters or yards, I'm not good at those, but of the city square itself, you see the remnants of St. Florian's Gate is the name of the gate, and the Barbican is a rounded structure that used to be a fortification protecting the wall, actually, outside of the wall of the city. So you can still get a sense of how the city may have been when you go to that part of town. In Krakow itself, again, the list of museums is probably endless, from Catholic Church museums to John Carroll Wojtyła Museum to Art Museum, Historical Museum. There's just a slew of them.
And you mentioned you didn't get to all of them. Which ones did you get to?
I got to see, and some of them were just random. There's a national museum that was undergoing some renovations, so basically a lot of the things were not available, but it just had items from different times, and specifically related to John Paul II was a specific exhibit they had at the time, which was open. But then you could also go to the Archbishop's Museum down towards Wawel Castle. Again, on the hill, there's a slew of them on the hill that were pretty interesting as well. I did not get to see the Czartoryski Museum, which is a family that used to be part of nobility for centuries in Poland, and their museum includes a collection of artifacts, not just from Poland, but from Egypt and other places around the world, too, that I guess they amassed through the centuries. And that one was one I wish I'd gone to see because I read about it in a couple of different places. Outside of the city, there's a few more things you need to hit, but as far as Krakow center proper, that's, I would say, the general sites, all anchored around that square.
Okay. As you were reading your guidebooks, preparing for the trip, anything that they recommended that you didn't think was worth the time?
Not really. I only had so many days in town. Actually, once you take out the travel days, we're talking about 5 hardcore days to hit whatever I wanted to see. So there was plenty that was pretty worthwhile that I prioritized first. So no, I don't think I had any misses. When I tell you later about my day trips, I guess you'll see why. I guess I didn't get a good sense of how good the food was going to be, but that's probably not as big a deal as far as planning the trip. Maybe the other thing that I had to do more on my own was research on transportation. The guidebooks generally gave you information on buses and routes, but you never know if that's still accurate or not. So you still need to do your own checking before the trip to make sure you have the latest information on things like that.
And you say the food was a surprise. I can't actually picture what Polish food would be like, except for maybe kielbasa or something like that.
I come from a Cuban family, so we eat a lot of pork, and they eat a lot of pork apparently, or at least I saw it in many, many menus and many dishes, and that to me was a very pleasant surprise because that's one of my favorite foods. Also surprised how little I saw vegetables in the menu. Potatoes aside, when I ate vegetables, it was at Italian restaurants because I had spinach, so it kind of surprised me. It was winter too. I don't know if that had an effect, produce not being as readily available, but the food was delicious. And I had the pork knuckles, which are one of their specialties. You also the pierogies, dumplings, whatever, are one of their specialty, and they have all sorts of them. I didn't get to sample as many different ones as I probably would have wanted. I only had so many meals that I could fit in a week, but the food was delicious. The one surprise at the restaurants usually was when they brought you the bread. They brought you the butter, and in another container they brought you lard. So you could use lard on your bread instead of the butter if you want it. I had to try it. I did try it. I didn't do it often.
And then you mentioned side trips.
Yeah, side trips, we had to prioritize. We didn't get to fit in all the things we thought we could do. I'll start maybe from the closest ones to town, the salt mines at Wieliczka, which is about maybe 20 minutes outside of the city. We took a bus to get there and then just walked a little bit to the actual salt mines. These mines were not the longest in operation, but just about, I think the longest in operation are like 30 kilometers away somewhere else in Poland. But there you go down wooden staircases and you get to see all these underground chambers and sculptures, statues, chandeliers, things made by miners originally and maybe in the last few decades.
Sculptures from salt or sculptures from rock? Or
yeah, from rock salt.
From rock salt,
from the mine itself. Yeah, it's fantastic. And the chandeliers, for example, they do something to the salt to obviously make it clear that's not the natural state of the salt. Statues and the carvings on the walls of the chambers, and there's even a chamber. It's huge. Can't tell you exactly. Again, I'm bad with size and distance, but it's about maybe a basketball court and a half in length. It's huge. It's a cavernous chapel, actually, a basilica, I think it's what they're calling it, underground. It's fascinating, and that's a short trip away from the city. You can actually fit it in half a day, counting the back and forth. and you walk about 3 kilometers underground, and they say that's only 1% of the total set of passageways.
Oh, my.
Yeah, it's a fantastic experience.
Now,
so
you
that's
took
a key one.
public transportation out there, or you took a tour there?
We totally did it on our own, and to go to the salt mines, it was a bus, but it depended on the place and the recommendation. Like Auschwitz, which is another side trip
sure.
I'll tell you about, you'd have the option of train or bus, but through research, you find out that if you take the train, it'll take you 2.5 hours, but if you take a bus, it'll be a lot quicker than that. There's a certain requirement for the timing because there's a movie at 11, at least at the time I went, that gives you an overview. And if you take the train, you may miss the start of the movie because the train only leaves at a certain time. If you go to Wadowice, where John Paul was born, for example, the train was not working, or at least at that time of the year, it wasn't working. So we ended up taking a minivan, one of those private vehicles.
Sure.
Which was its own experience because I didn't know how to tell the driver to stop or where to stop because I had no idea where I was going. So that's why learning some Polish ahead of time helped me to say the pleasantries and have people want to help me out, I guess.
After you were done with the pleasantries, how easy was it to make yourself understood if you had to resort to English?
I don't know if I'm making this up in my mind or not, but there seemed to be a generational divide as to whether people will speak English or not.
Very
and
typical.
It makes some sense, right? If you think people 40 or older who maybe were learning German or Russian as their second language. But I found that true, surprisingly, at train stations. The ladies who were working behind the windows at any train station in Warsaw or in Krakow, at least they never spoke English to me. Whether they were shy or didn't speak it, I don't know. But I had to use Polish to ask for my tickets and questions of fares and things like that because they were not upfront in talking English to me. Then when the people were younger, I never had any issue with people speaking in English.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And I don't know, again, if that's just my luck that particular set of days, but I'm glad I worked on some phrases and some basic stuff related to pleasantries, transportations, and your numbers, basically.
Sure. And in getting around in general, you're taking buses and public transportations and trains, and that got you around. It sounds like generally fine, except when the train isn't working.
Right. No issues whatsoever. I mean, everything runs pretty well. Nothing at all to complain about or warn people about in my experience.
Okay. And then you also mentioned Auschwitz.
Yeah, Auschwitz, Birkenau are the two main camps in that area, Auschwitz being the original and Birkenau being a follow-on because they couldn't mass do what they were doing, killing and burning and cremating, whatever. So Birkenau gets built afterwards. And it's a day trip. It depends how much time you want to spend. And you should go to Auschwitz first because that's where you get the movie. That's where you may get the guided tour if you want to set it all in context and get all the information you need. And then go to Birkenau, which is some distance away. I guess you could walk it, but it seemed a little too long to walk. It didn't seem like a clear pathway, whatever. So what we did, we got to Auschwitz. We took the guided tour. We skipped the movie because the guided tour would probably give us a lot of that information. It was eerie at first. If you had to pick something to give you the tone for what you were going to see, and for the weather, it was perfect. I mean, the weather was gray, foggy. It gave you that sense of sadness, and it set the mood, I guess, right for what I was to see. Auschwitz, by all means, go get the guided tour, go into the buildings where they take you. They will show you things that will shock you, move you, things that were property of the people who passed away, who were killed there, other things. I won't give it all away, I suppose. But you really need to see it. They actually get to walk you through one of the original crematoriums, which is very small, and that about takes care of any doubt you had or so how you would feel because pretty much you see that and it becomes very, very real. Walking into Auschwitz for me felt a little odd because you see it in movies, so I felt like I was seeing stuff I know from the movies. And it felt like a little bit Hollywoodish for me walking through the gate. But again, once you go through the buildings and see all the stuff they have to show you, obviously you're somewhere else. Birkenau, it got destroyed by the Germans when they were leaving, so they reconstructed one little piece, and then they reconstructed chimneys from the buildings that used to be there, so you get a sense of how big the camp was, and it is outstanding how huge that facility was. As far as the eye can see, you see those chimneys. For me, the most shocking moment of all, both camps, was standing at the platform where the people got off the train in Birkenau, and that was a platform where they made a choice: do you live or do you die? I still get goosebumps talking about it right now. That to me was the most difficult moment, I think. So definitely a day trip. It's obviously worth the visit and more. It's surreal in a way. You can't just believe you're standing there and you see the big crematoriums were demolished and they were never touched. And you stand in front of them and you're looking at them and you stand there in awe, really, of how could there be so much evil. Another side trip we took was to go to Częstochowa, which is about a 2 or 3 hour train ride away. All the durations start blurring. It's the site, I don't know if they would call it the spiritual center of Poland, but it kind of felt like it from the readings and what I witnessed. It's got this, I think it's a monastery, Jasna Gora Monastery, but it's, again, up on a hill, walled area in the city. It has the monasteries, and it's a historical site. When the Swedes and others have tried to invade Poland, that's been one of the most difficult sites for them to take over, I guess. And the Swedes, I think in the 1600s may have been, were actually not able to, and that saved Poland at the time. And it's known more than anything for the image of the Black Madonna, which is probably the patron virgin of Poland, Catholic Poland. And there's actually a ceremony that takes place at the chapel where that image is stored. The image is, most of the time, it's covered with some kind of screen, metal screen. But there's a ceremony that happens, I want to say twice a day. It's the uncovering and then the covering of the image. So we got there by coincidence. We took the earliest train we could, and we got there, I don't know, 11-ish. And it was about 20 minutes before the image was to be uncovered for viewing. And then, of course, an hour and a half, 2 hours later, it was going to be covered. So it worked beautifully because we got the time in between to check out everything else in the compound and then go see the recovering. But what was impressive to me was watching everyone else around. I'm not Polish, so the Black Madonna, though I'm Catholic, it doesn't have an extended meaning like it may to them. But watching people there gather at the chapel for that time and do all this veneration, I suppose, or whatever prayers they're doing those ceremonies was pretty moving, actually, to get a sense of the Polish spirituality, I guess. So that was very interesting to me. I tried to get spiritually connected. It didn't quite happen for me, but it was great to see it and learn something about how they view it. Częstochowa itself, as a town, it's got a beautiful big boulevard that goes all the way from the monastery or the Jasna Gora compound all the way down towards the train station area. That's a beautiful boulevard to walk around and have coffee or something. Now, again, it was winter, so it wasn't probably as beautiful as it is in the spring. It was a nice side trip to take. I don't know if it's for everyone, but the compound itself does have a lot of historical things. You can see all the weaponry and armory and stuff like that used over the centuries. It's a walled city, so you can go inside the walls and see the ramparts and things like that. So there's a little bit of everything there, not just the Black Madonna, but it's very historic and very central, from my understanding of it, to the Polish people, I guess.
Interesting. With the trip to Krakow, what do you wish you'd known before you'd gone?
I guess I wish I'd known that I would want to stay longer.
Well, that's a pretty good thing to know.
I may have been able to pull that off if I really had set my heart on that, but not once I was there. Once I was there, my plans were fairly firm. There was just more to see and to explore. So I went to these places. I went to Wadowice, where John Paul was born. These are known places, highly known. What are the next level of places? What are those small towns where maybe you can just go and get a different sense of Polish life, perhaps more towards the rural areas? I didn't have a good insight as to what would be those places, and I didn't have the time to discover on my own this time. If I go back, and I hope I do go back, that would be something I'll be looking for. The other part of the area that I didn't see was the mountains, the Tatra Mountains, which I hear are very beautiful. Zakopane is a ski resort area. It's more touristy that way. But that mountains in general, they sound like they're beautiful, and I wish I had time to go and explore. I went in winter, too, which may not have been the best time to get lost in the mountains. But those are things I wish I could have done, and maybe I'll look to do someday.
And the best day you had there?
I'm Catholic, and going to Wadowice and seeing the birthplace of this, not only a religious figure, but a pretty historical figure in the last century. Sure. It was very moving, actually, to think that a child from that town, from that condition, once you see the family and what they were about and where they lived, could grow to become this figure was very moving. That any child has the potential to be something that big, no matter where they come from. That, to me, was very moving, actually, as well. Obviously, Auschwitz, and that was also very compelling, I guess.
And who was the most memorable person you met?
Oh, goodness, most memorable person. My initial reaction to your question was the guy who was letting us in the apartment that we rented for the week. We rented an apartment. We found a great deal online, right by the square, actually.
How interesting.
Getting off the taxi from the train station, this guy met us at the door, and this guy spoke perfect Spanish. I'm a Spanish speaker, a native Spanish speaker, and this guy spoke it like me. but he was Polish. Just very surprising how just getting there, I immediately meet someone who lived in Mexico, I don't know how many years, 2 years, 3 years, and spoke beautiful Spanish, as well as obviously English, which was the language we started communicating through. It kind of set a little bit of a tone for the town. It may not be the center of power anymore in Poland, but it's still an important city in Poland, and it's not a provincial town. It has a feel of it's a real international city, but yet of a very manageable size. It's not like going to London or Rome or places like that. I mean, it's much more manageable, but yet it has all that flavor. It's as alive as a large city is. And I think that guy gave me that sense from the first moment I got to Krakow.
Okay. As we go to wind this down, finish this sentence for me. You really know you're in Krakow when what?
Well, I was going to say when it was bitterly cold, but that's because I went in winter. It was amazing because I thought, well, this is the stupidest thing I'm doing going to southern Poland in the middle of winter. But I think we were there in a warmer week for them. Everyone was out and about, and it just felt alive. I don't know if it was just the weather or what, but it felt alive to me. Even with the cold weather, even when there were no outdoor seating in cafes because it was too cold,
sure,
people were out and about. We drew energy from that. We used to walk in the crowds at rush hour just because it felt good.
And if you had to summarize Krakow in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Oh, historic, beautiful, a beautiful town, just looking around. Livable, actually.
Interesting. Raul, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your adventures in Krakow.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chris. And I hope you do get to go to Krakow soon.
Yeah, me too, but there's so many places I haven't seen. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
And in Internet Resources today, I want to suggest another travel podcast, which is different from the Amateur Traveler, called Betty in the Sky with a Suitcase at bettyinthesky.com. Betty is a flight attendant who tells humorous stories of things that happen during airline travel. And one of the bits that she included in her show this week, I found fairly humorous. You may not, depending on your stand on gun control, but it's basically a take on how they have allowed pilots and co-pilots to carry weapons, and this is an announcement you may not hear the next time you fly.
Good afternoon, this is your captain speaking with just a little flight information. Coming up on the left, we're going to be catching a glimpse of the Grand Canyon. On the right, you can be able to see the Hoover Dam in just a few minutes. We're flying at an altitude of 37,000 feet, and our airspeed is 400 miles an hour. Couple little facts here. I'm packing a Colt King Cobra. That's a .357 caliber firearm with a black rubber grip and a 6-inch barrel. Also, the co-pilot is carrying a Kimber Custom Defense pistol with all the bells and whistles you'd expect from a custom gun of that kind, with an alloy frame and bevel treatment on the entire gun. And our chief flight attendant, Roger, has a Ruger Bearcat 22 with a hand-fluted cylinder. All 3 are capable of piercing body armor at a distance of up to 27 feet, and it can put a hole in human bone and flesh the size of the Grand Canyon, which, by the way, is coming up on the left-hand side of the plane, so just sit back and relax and enjoy the rest of the flight.
And for those of you I haven't offended yet, I have 2 different places where I've been interviewed recently that I want to point you at. I'll put a link to both of these in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. The first one is I was interviewed by my good friend Victor Callao for the Typical Shutterbug podcast talking about travel photography. So you might want to check that out. And the second one, I was interviewed by my good friend Linda Martin, who is one of the hosts of the Indie Travel podcast, on their show talking about traveling to Oaxaca, Mexico, in case you're interested in going there now that the panic about swine flu seems to be dying down. And then lastly, I had a ping on Facebook from Stephanie, who asked me a question about the Moscow podcast. She was looking for information from John because we had mentioned a particular visa service that he had used. Just so you know, that's the kind of information that you can find in the show notes when I say check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. So this particular episode is a great one. For instance, if you're looking up the name of the salt mines or that particular monastery we talked about, especially since we were using Polish words, it might be easier just go to amateurtraveler.com and look where I've already looked up how to spell those words rather than guessing at how to spell them yourself. So I bring that up to help you out with that. And with that, we'll bring this episode of The Amateur Traveler to a close. I would like to encourage you to follow me on Twitter if you're using Twitter. The last 3 guests on the show we found through Twitter, so that's also a way that I'm finding guests these days. Feel free to leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com or drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more